You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. Freedom, tolerance, respect for the rule of law, belief in social responsibility and respect for British institutions. That's what Prime Minister David Cameron believes should be taught in all primary and secondary schools in England. He's backing the Education Secretary's plans to promote British values in the classroom, following the Trojan horse allegations, which revealed that some head teachers had failed to tackle religious extremism in some schools in the West Midlands. So much debate surrounding what exactly British values are and how they will be introduced has ensued on Twitter, in newspapers and in conversations. And to talk about it here at Radio VR, I'm joined by Sunny Handal, journalist and contributor to national newspapers. On the telephone, Professor Paul Ward, who's Head of History, English Languages and Media at the University of Huddersfield and author of Call Yourself British, National Identity in the United Kingdom in the 20th Century. And Christina Cranfield, an artist and filmmaker and author of Manufactured Britishness project. So will Britain agree on what British values are before promoting them in schools? And is the debate hitting the right tone? Where should we start? Who would like to tell me what they believe British values are and whether the Prime Minister's got it right? Sunny.
I think that British values end up being whatever people like to define themselves as, so they're a very personal thing. And part of the problem is that the UK hasn't really thought long and hard about what does it mean to be British in a sort of a modern context. And I think, there's a political precedence to this in the sense that in 2007, Gordon Brown said the same thing about schools. And at that time, the Conservatives laughed it off as an idea. So, this debate constantly keeps on coming around and constantly goes nowhere, which is my frustration. And then no one really has an idea or sort of some direction on where to take this Britishness project or where to talk about or how do you define it. And so it goes nowhere. I mean, I have my own definitions, but I'm just saying there's a lot of political context to this, and I think it's just neither time has it gone anywhere.
And it's this debate now follows obviously the Trojan horse scandal. Is that? I suppose I'll ask you, Professor Paul Ward, do you think that has been the best catalyst to start this debate again?
Well, I think this idea that there is groups of disloyal people in the country often provokes discussions about what British values are. And this isn't the first time this has happened, about where one group of people in the UK are asked if they're loyal enough, because we had the Tebbit cricket test in the 1990s that asked whether West Indians were loyal. In the 1920s, the question was asked about Jews. In the 19th century, it was asked about the Catholic Irish. So this sort of worry about how a group of people think about Britain often acts as a catalyst for these discussions. Do
you think the discussion is currently hitting the right tone?
It's got one of those British values of an underlying xenophobia and racism with it, so I don't think it's hitting the right tone at all. I think often these discussions emerge out of people feeling quite insecure and wanting to sort of burrow down into a sort of core type of value that suits themselves and their political agenda.
Christina Cranfield, then, you author of Manufactured Britishness project. Tell us about that and how you think this debate is going and what British values are to you.
Sure. The project actually was inspired by my own experiences because I'm Russian and I became British like 6 years ago, and I had to go through all this sort of I had to pass Life in the UK test, and the inspiration for the film takes a lot of information from the Life in the UK test, how like Britain tried to introduce this test in order to find this unified meaning for Britishness. And when you have these perfect questions and you have the answers, and that's what makes you British. And my project really looks it's sort of a provocative and speculative vision of the future, where I'm almost asking, well, what is next? What is next after the test? And basically, in my future, I'm introducing almost like sort of a zone where you have to physically start showing how British you are, and you have to prove that. And that's sort of I'm trying to push that to the limit, and basically ask at what point does one stop being an immigrant and actually become British? So, yeah.
And obviously you became British, like you say, through the Life in the UK test. Having completed the test, what did it make you feel like?
To be honest, the whole experience of going through the test is pretty absurd because because you have questions that kind of do not help you in any way to be more British or to kind of feel more British. And then afterwards you also have to go for a ceremony where you have to sing the anthem to the Queen, you have to swear on a Union Jack, and you actually have to pay for it as well, and that needs to be done. Without that you're not gonna be British. And sort of all these steps, they're becoming very absurd and almost asking, okay, what's next? It's
I mean, I think Christina raises a very interesting point, though, about the citizenship ceremonies themselves. I mean, before the last Labour government, there were no citizenship ceremonies. And in one sense, it's a ritual, a ritual to just try and say to people who come into this country, now you are officially part of us. And we never did that beforehand, And America has a fantastic tradition of doing that to immigrants who come in and say, you are now, you sing their national anthem and you sort of pledge allegiance to the flag, and it kind of gives people some form of sort of, this is it, I've done this ceremony thing now, so I'm now officially British, whereas beforehand it was just like, here's your passport, off you go. And I mean, I understand what she says about it being a bit absurd, and I looked at the Britishness test and I thought, this is really crazy, I wouldn't pass it even though I was born here. But I think the rituals, to a certain extent, are important to try and get people to think about, that they belong to this country now, and they are now different citizens to a different land, and they officially, technically, pledge allegiance to the Queen as opposed to some other country. So it's necessary. It's a bit of an absurd ritual, but I still think it's necessary.
But I would say the thing about this latest discussion about British values and teaching it in schools isn't just about immigrants. It's actually about people who were born here and consider themselves to be British as well. What it's suggesting is that the whole population somehow needs testing, because if you teach children in schools, then inevitably you have to start working out how they've performed, or if you want a league table. So you have to start testing them. And that's not about people who have arrived or become British 6 years ago or 10 years ago or 20 years ago. It's going to be about young Muslims, people with Pakistani parents, people from Nigeria who were born in Britain, consider themselves to be British, and are then told, well, actually, you need to learn how to be British, even though they know perfectly well how to be British because they live in British streets and they've got British friends, they are British. And I think that's the greater absurdity of this idea about having British values taught in schools now. Completely different from a citizenship test, which does provide that ritual. You have succeeded in getting a UK passport, therefore you are British.
Sure, Paul, I agree with that, but I do think there is something to be said about having the discussion and actually having talking about, should we teach a sense of British values in classes? So, I mean, I accept that these people are British citizens, and that's not under consideration. No one's talking about sort of stripping them of their citizenship. But I do think that people feel slightly worried about what's being taught in schools, especially religious schools, and I think this goes across the board. So this isn't just a controversy that arises when it comes to Muslim schools. There have been controversies around Christian schools, and other kinds of schools, religious schools, where people go off and they start teaching creationism, for example, or Catholic schools, which have had in the past very gory videos about abortion. So I think that so the question is, if we do talk about Britishness and we do come to some form of consensus about what needs to be taught, that might actually help shape some policy around schools, and I don't see that as a bad thing.
But I would say that schools' curriculums teach people how to live in the countries in which they live, and that's different from teaching a version of Britishness. Because if you start to decide to teach a version of Britishness, I agree it may lead to more agreement about what constitutes Britishness, but it will always be contested by parents, by children, by teachers. I would say there are a core set of things that identify the British as British. And, the Queen's one of them, but 20% of the population is Republican. The one I always favour and the one I always respond about a British value is the National Health Service. Lots of Britons in the post-war period thought that they'd fought the Second World War and won it in order to have a National Health Service free and at the point of delivery. We call it national, it's for all of us. But I'm not sure that David Cameron or Michael Gove would want that being taught in schools. So I think there are some things that lots of people would agree with British, but I think when you start to think about some sort of curriculum-based British studies, then I think it's much more difficult.
The thing is, what's quite interesting, in some way, like coming back to like citizenship, there's very interesting and diverse research which I did and comparison between the study guide of citizenship and Britishness and what actually people say what it is. And I did actually ask younger people what do they think citizenship, for example, is. And I did ask British young 15, 16 years old guys, and they said, oh, we don't know, it's a lesson at school where you have to learn about the rights, and that's what for them citizenship is. And I don't know, I feel that just the whole debate on really trying to unify Britishness, it just cannot be done because it's just very diverse as the whole sort of it's a very diverse culture. You cannot define Britishness.
But you can, though. I mean, in fact, I think the fact that the country is becoming more diverse culturally and racially makes it even more important to have an idea about what Britishness means, because otherwise the country does not have a sort of a cohesive identity.
I would agree that's important, Sonny, but I'm not sure that schools are the place to have that discussion.
Why not?
As part of a curriculum, because no one will agree what should be discussed. Therefore, it might be better just to have it broadly open about discussion about things like identities and about citizenship, about rights, rather than assigning it the idea that it is part of the national essence. And I think that's my problem with it, that sometimes the notions of Britishness or Englishness or Welshness or Scottishness boil down to an essence that you either have it or you don't, and that it can't. It becomes exclusive. So teaching what it means to live in Britain might be a better thing than teaching what it is to be British. Because I think if you tell people that to be British is to have a stiff upper lip and drink cups of tea, then they'll just laugh. If you tell people that the way of living in Britain is to have respect for your neighbours and your fellow citizens, then I don't think they'll laugh. I think they'll start to understand. They'll start to be in a position to understand that it's our difference that makes us British.
No, I mean, I disagree. I think if you have a lesson in class which says be nice to your neighbours, I'm not sure if students are going to go along with that, or at least they'll laugh it off.
If you have a lesson in class that actively shows them, that practically shows them that getting on with your neighbours is a good thing, practical projects, art projects, community projects, that's far better than having a text-based and tested curriculum.
No, well, I mean, here's where I disagree. I think you can have something. What I would do is have, firstly, you would have citizenship classes. So when you turn 16, you would have, what does it mean to have, the fact that we don't have a British constitution. So, what does a Magna Carta mean? What is the history? How did it come along? What does it mean to be a British citizen? What rights do we have? What responsibilities do we have? Firstly, those are the sort of questions around our relationships with the constitution and the rights and responsibilities we have as citizens. Then secondly, you would have some other discussion about British history, and I would include the bad and the good, the empire, sort of the creation of the Magna Carta as well as the creation of the UK. I'm just saying that, there's lots of things that you can talk about which are about how did we come to where we are and what sort of country we're in, what kind of rights and responsibilities you have, and what you should do going forward.
I think that's fine, but I'm a historian. I'm happy for people to be taught history, but when you teach history, it's about different interpretations and looking at the evidence and thinking about alternatives. I think schools are already doing that. because Michael Gove wanted to emphasise British history, it turns out that he's already had his way in terms of teaching British values, because the discussion of the new history curriculum actually was broadly British-based. So I'm not sure we would be adding anything to what teachers are already expected to do.
Yeah, no, I agree with that.
Bureaucracy.
I agree with that point, which is why I think that this is not going to go anywhere.
I agree.
Exactly. It seems a knee-jerk reaction to the Trojan horse scandal, which has dominated sort of the news agenda for a long time. What is more interesting is actually the debate on what it is to be a British citizen and sort of the citizenship test, and whether that becomes part of being a British value. It is part of one of British values, understanding what it means to be a citizen. And that is perhaps not able to be taught in schools. So whilst we have the idea that, yes, there needs to be the discussion in schools, and I agree with Paul that potentially that having a test on it is not the right way to necessarily go about it, and actually a history module talking about British history, shouldn't that be enough?
Well, I mean, look, I think Britishness or British values or the idea of a British identity is a very political one. So actually, I think that teaching it in schools is important, but you're teaching it from a political perspective. You're saying this is what you mean when you start voting, this is why you should vote, etc., etc. Where the difference is what does it mean to, what Britishness is not is a cultural identity, right? So what we don't have is a sense of I think people being, what does it mean to act British? That's where it breaks down. So, in many ways, my cultural traditions are in many cases Indian because I'm of Indian heritage, and Christina might be British, but she might do lots of things which are Russian, for example. I'm just speculating here, and in many ways, I feel English. And when we watch football, you support the English football team, and you do things which are many ways people would describe as English. So I think that distinction needs to be made. When we talk about British values, we are essentially talking about political values, not cultural values. And I think it's if we conflate the two and you start thinking you're going to start teaching people about drinking tea in schools, that's not going to happen, because that's a cultural tradition, and that is not what Britishness is.
I entirely agree with the idea of ensuring that people know about their political rights, and I think that can be taught very easily. But I'm not sure that's what the Conservatives think that they're talking about, because I think they are talking about teaching cultural values, and I think that's where it all does collapse, because we do all have different cultural values, and we can't even stereotype someone who was born white English to an English family and decide that means that they will act in a particular way, because we all make choices all the time about how we respond to different things. So I would agree we can teach politics in schools, we can teach citizenship in schools, but we can't actually then be sure how people will respond to that teaching, because actually one of the things I don't understand why we should be telling people that they should vote when voting doesn't seem to change very much.
And the
people died fighting for it, so I kind of think it's fairly important.
The ambiguity of value is that's what you have a problem with, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely, because patriotism and national identity have always been contested. They always will be contested. I heard Sunny say that people have died fighting for the vote, and that they certainly have. But they've also died fighting against other people's views on politics across. And Britain. One of the things the British like to think about themselves is that they're a fairly peaceful people. That they're fairly unwarlike. They'll stereotype others like that. Oh,
come on! Actually, I don't think we think that. I don't think anyone thinks that.
I think lots of the British have seen that to be the case completely wrongly. Because what they've done is often they fought around the world to establish a set of British cultural values in the empire. And then again, they fought in 2 world wars over what they considered to be British values. But not everyone agreed on what those values were. And it also looked very different if you were the one on the receiving end of British imperialism, as it told you it was the best way to rule the world.
And Christina, having listened to Paul and Sunny, where would you sort of take your next project in terms of the value being the British value being ambiguous and the citizenship being something that you can sort of far more tangible to sort of work with as an artistic project?
At the moment, I'm not thinking about that. At the moment, I'm actually more pushing it into a even more dystopian space. And actually, it is happening even. It's a continuation actually of my project where you start, where you basically you can see how Britishness is being upheld at the moment to quite an unhealthy level in all different sort of industries. So, for example, if you take these new developments that I started visiting very recently, the new developments that are trying to almost this sort of eco-patriotic values and rebuild England that used to be in like 18th, 19th century. And these developments are taking place now and trying sort of to I don't know if I'm making sense, but basically architecture becomes even trying to sort of return something back that already has gone in a way. So you need kind of to work with what we have to move on with times and not trying to define something either by architecture or by making people to learn something. It's not really a Britain that I know in a way. It's a very tolerant society, and so far as I have experience. And in the recent sort of years, what I see it becoming more and more aggressive, this Britishness, and it's just being absurd. Why? Well, who is British? Who is British? If you think about it, who is British?
I mean, that's a good question, isn't it? And that's what it comes down to. But I think that's, in fact, you've put the finger on the button, which is because people don't know who is British or they don't know how to define this idea of Britishness, they are even more concerned about where the country is heading to, because they feel like, this country is becoming increasingly diverse culturally. We have lots of immigration coming in and out. And then because of that, they feel like, we're losing a sense of identity. And you don't have to have that discussion when everyone's the same. But when people start changing, and then people start thinking, we need a common language. And I think that's where it comes in. And you will see more of this. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do think that progressives have to get involved with that and say, we can shape this in a positive way. It could be about stuff like tolerance, but the fact that, UK can promote democracy and free speech. And actually in the survey, the value most people rated as a British value was free speech, 48% of British people. And I think that's a fantastic thing. I love free speech, and I think that should be protected and promoted. So I would have no problems pushing that in schools.
Paul, would you agree?
Well, I'm happy to promote free speech in schools, but I wouldn't say it's a particularly British value because it's a value that's widely held. So yeah, I'm happy with that, but I wouldn't want to attach the idea of Britishness directly to it. I mean, I would say that one thing that again, as a historian, I try and take a longer view, and I'd say that Britain has been diverse for centuries, and that we've had these discussions about what constitutes being British across the last 200 years at least, as Britain was formed and changed and so on. Now, I think so. What we always seem to think is we're about to hit a crisis caused by diversity. Actually, it's a very healthy thing to constantly discuss the ways in which we're changing. What I would say is that being British emerges somehow out of those discussions. It's not imposed on us from above. That I would say, I mean, of course, there's the referendum on Scottish independence in the autumn, and that will certainly change the way people feel about being British if Scotland votes for independence. So change is healthy for national identities, healthy for Britishness, because we'll keep talking about it, and talking about it is quite a vital sign of a nation, I would have said.
Go on, Sunny.
But Paul, I was just going to say, yeah, you're right that this country's always been diverse, but I mean, it has gone through its fastest period of change in its history. So I don't think that can be discounted. And any country that has a very diverse population, and the two countries I'm thinking of are India and America, they have a very strong sense of national identity, because you have to have a common sense of national identity almost to maintain a common language and a bond between people who in other contexts are very, very different to each other.
But what we'd also discover in both India and the United States is, despite looking like that they have that strong sense of identity, they certainly have. We could just as easily unpick both those countries and look at the diversities there. The view from outside of Britain is that it's disunited, but that's as much as anything about Scottish devolution and the potential for independence. On the whole, when you go abroad, people can't tell the difference between someone who's Scottish, Welsh, or English. They're all just considered British and sometimes misnamed as English, because actually that we do share things in common, and we're actually quite recognisable when we go elsewhere. Whatever we look like, we share the same ways of behaving.
Does anyone agree with Christina that there is that the debate and the role of citizenship is becoming more aggressive in the UK?
I would say that the way it's being driven by UKIP and then the major parties are responding, actually, yes, it is becoming more aggressive. And I think that's not just aggressive in tone at the top. I think that's going to lead to greater violence on the day-to-day level, greater humiliations for people who have to suffer at the hands of people who feel empowered by saying that there's something that needs protecting and it's threatened by new immigrants or old immigrants.
I mean, I think I would probably disagree. I think that this country is broadly becoming more tolerant as time goes on, and broadly becoming more comfortable with immigration. Not to say that there aren't concerns, but the younger generation is far more tolerant and open to immigration than the older generation. So I think that, yeah, there's always going to be stuff like this. I mean, back in Thatcher days, there used to be quite strong language around immigrants swamping, the country. Even Tony Blair and sort of Gordon Brown had debates around this issue, and now Cameron inevitably will do and was always going to have this debate. I don't think that it changes much, to be honest, and because, as we both agreed on earlier, because they don't have a specific definition of what they want to impose, and because people will laugh off any ridiculous ideas, it's not going to go far. But this is expected. We were always going to have a debate about Englishness because there is some concern. And I think that we can't just say, we shouldn't be having this given the context because it's risky and it risks alienating people. I think we have to have this debate. And I think even progressives on the left, people like myself, for example, have always been saying for years that unless we get involved in the debate and try and shape it, then it will become a bit more right-wing. But we should try and say, there are progressive parts to patriotism, and why not explore that?
My response would be that actually I agree that the progressives have got to take part in this debate, but we haven't got to give in to a view that's imposed on us by the right. Actually, we can say that being British is about being tolerant, it's about being welcoming, and it's about not allowing xenophobia and racism to have a greater voice.
Agree.
Christina?
I just also I very much agree with Paul on that, and I also I feel that there is just it's a useless exercise to try to define Britishness in a written context, and it's just impossible to do. It depends how far you look. Everybody came from somewhere, so it's not going to go anywhere apart from racism and xenophobia. And I do hope really that it will be again soon more tolerant society than. Yes, that is actually where it's going now.
That was Christina Cranfield there, artist, filmmaker and author of Manufactured Britishness project. I was also joined by Sunny Handal, journalist and contributor to national newspapers, and Professor Paul Ward, head of History, English, Languages and Media at the University of Huddersfield and author of Call Yourself British, National Identity in the United Kingdom in the 20th Century.
Emerge out of people feeling quite insecure and wanting to sort of burrow down into a sort of core type of value that suits themselves and their political agenda.
Christina Cranfield, then, you author of Manufactured Britishness project. Tell us about that and how you think this debate is going and what British values are to you.
Sure. Well, the project actually was inspired by my own experiences because I'm Russian and I became British like 6 years ago, and I had to go through all this sort of I had to pass Life in the UK test, and the inspiration for the film takes a lot of information from the Life in the UK test, how like Britain tried to introduce this test in order to find this unified like meaning for Britishness. And when you have these perfect questions and you have the answers, and that's what makes you British. And my project really looks it's sort of provocative and speculative vision of the
tone. Where should we start? Who would like to tell me what they believe British values are and whether the Prime Minister's got it right? Sunny.
I think that British values end up being whatever people like to define themselves as, so they're a very personal thing. And part of the problem is that the UK hasn't really thought long and hard about what does it mean to be British in a sort of a modern context. And I think, there's a political precedence to this in the sense that in 2007, Gordon Brown said the same thing about schools. And at that time, the Conservatives laughed it off as an idea. So, this debate constantly keeps on coming around and constantly goes nowhere, which is my frustration. And then no one really has an idea or sort of some direction on where to take this Britishness project or where to talk about or how do you define it. And so it goes nowhere. I mean, I have my own definitions, but I'm just saying there's a lot of political context to this, and I think it's just neither time has it.
You're listening to Radio VR with me, Juliet Spare. Freedom, tolerance, respect for the rule of law, belief in social responsibility and respect for British institutions. That's what Prime Minister David Cameron believes should be taught in all primary and secondary schools in England. He's backing the Education Secretary's plans to promote British values in the classroom, following the Trojan horse allegations, which revealed that some head teachers had failed to tackle religious extremism in some schools in the West Midlands. So much debate surrounding what exactly British values are and how they will be introduced has ensued on Twitter, in newspapers and in conversations. And to talk about it here at Radio VR, I'm joined by Sunny Handal, journalist and contributor to national newspapers. On the telephone, Professor Paul Ward, who's head of History, English Languages and Media at the University of Huddersfield and author of Call Yourself British, National Identity in the United Kingdom in the 20th Century. And Christina Cranfield, an artist and filmmaker and author of Manufactured Britishness project. So will Britain agree on what British values are before promoting them in schools? And is the debate hitting the right
future, where I'm almost asking, well, what is next? What is next after the test? And basically, in my future, I'm introducing almost like sort of a zone where you have to physically start showing how British you are, and you have to prove that. And that's sort of kind of I'm trying to push that to the limit, and basically ask like, at what point does one stop being an immigrant and actually become British? So, yeah.
And obviously you became British, like you say, through the Life in the UK test. Having completed the test, what did it make you feel like?
To be honest, the whole experience of going through the test is pretty absurd because you have questions that kind of do not help you in any way to be more British or to kind of feel more British. And then afterwards you also have to go for a ceremony where you have to sing.
Gone anywhere.
And it's this debate now follows obviously the Trojan horse scandal. Is that I suppose I'll ask you, Professor Poole-Ward, do you think that has been the best catalyst to start this debate again?
Well, I think this idea that there is groups of disloyal people in the country often provokes discussions about what British values are. And this isn't the first time this has happened, about where one group of people in the UK are asked if they're loyal enough, because we had the Tebbit cricket test in the 1990s that asked whether West Indians were loyal. In the 1920s, the question was asked about Jews. In the 19th century, it was asked about the Catholic Irish. So this sort of worry about how a group of people think about Britain often acts as a catalyst for these discussions.
Do you think the discussion is currently hitting the right tone?
It's got one of those British values of an underlying xenophobia and racism with it, so I don't think it's hitting the right tone at all. I think often these discussions